and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about the flood factor. How do you avoid buying a property in a flood-prone area? Now, of course, in New Zealand, we've recently had two very large natural disasters. We had the Auckland anniversary floods, and that was followed up pretty closely by Cyclone Gabrielle. Really tough climate events that have meant that there has been significant flood damage to properties. So today, we're going to help you understand some of the tools you can use to figure out, well, is my property in a flood zone? And what do I need to check to make sure that my property has the lowest chance possible of getting flooded out? Now, Andrew, what are some of the things that property investors can check before they buy?
Well, I think one of the great things is online, there's a lot of tools. Now, Auckland Council has just released an excellent map called Flood Viewer. And you can go to Google and just type in Auckland Flood Viewer and it will come up, first thing that comes up. And you put in the address or the suburb or the street that you're looking at a property and it will tell you whether or not this is a flood-prone area.
Now, not every council is going to have this exact map, right?
No. So Invercargill's got a great one that we're looking at. Christchurch has got one, but it's pretty rough, right? So they've all got maps of some description, or again, you could search a LIM report to find out whether or not you were looking at something in a flood-prone area. But using these online tools is just a step before all of that, because maybe you can do some due diligence before you sign a contract.
Well, let's use this to get a sense of what this tool can actually tell us. So what's the first thing you notice as we scroll around this map, Andrew? And of course, we'll explain it for everybody listening to the show, but for all of you guys on YouTube, you can see this.
So you can see all these veins of blue area, which are the flood plains, and then you can look at the areas where you've got more risk of flood.
The most important thing is there are tons of floodplains all around Auckland. They're right around Auckland. There's heaps of them if you go on this map. So let's actually look at a property, maybe one that you've purchased recently, Andrew. Let's put an address in and we'll see what it looks like.
Okay, let's look at 355 Swanson Road.
Okay, so I'll type that in for you.
So this is in Ranui.
Well, this is an interesting one with this specific address. The map isn't registering the specific number of the street, so it'll take me to Swanson Road, but not to the specific development, which is right here. So I've had to kind of search around and find it using Google Maps. So this is the development here, Andrew. What do we see in terms of floodplains? So
right to the right-hand side, you've got floodplains, and then you've got a flood-prone area right next door or on one of the streets on neighbouring the development.
So what this would suggest is this specific development isn't in a flood-prone area. It's not on a floodplain. Some houses that are in the block next to it are in a floodplain, and there is a bit of a flood-prone area on one of the streets that are around it. Now, given that there are so many floodplains and flood-prone areas around Auckland, I wouldn't take this necessarily as a bad sign. You do have some of these little blue lines here. This shows the direction of water in a really catastrophic event. Now, one of the things that's really important to discuss is, okay, maybe you own a property in a floodplain. What does that actually mean? Well, what do you think it means, Andrew, without looking at your notes?
That there are streams underneath my house.
So what it means is there is a 1% chance in a given year that that property or that area could get flooded.
A 1% chance in any given year.
Yeah, so that means there's a 99% chance that your property won't get flooded. Now, of course, we're long-term buy and hold investors here on the show. So you've got to think about, well, over a 15-year period, what is the chance that my property, not necessarily the house, but the land, has a flood? And the answer is about 14% over a 15-year period. So if you've got a property or a piece of land that's got one of these blue parts over it, there is a 14% chance, that's slightly under a 1 in 5 chance, that there will be a flood over any given 15-year period.
So it's probably important to not panic if you've got a house here at the moment and you look and think, oh no, I'm never going to be able to sell this property because it's going to flood.
And the other thing that's important to note is that's about the land, not necessarily the house. So if you've got a piece of land, generally it'll be slightly sloped, it won't be completely flat. And generally the council won't let you build on what's called the low-lying area of that land, because that's where the water is going to flood to. They're usually going to make you build on a higher part of the land. But that raises a really good question, Andrew, about how do you figure out whether your house has the potential to get flooded if it's in one of these areas?
So I think the thing to remember is that it depends a little bit on probably when your house was constructed. So if your property is built lower to the ground, then you've got more risk of being flooded, right? Because if it's lower to the ground, then if the rain comes up, then it's going to flood more likely than if something's higher up. Now, if you've bought a property which is older, then they probably didn't have the same level of requirements 30, 40, 50 years ago than if you're building today. So if you're building a new property, then we've got these kind of tools and we've assessed the risk based on the likelihood of a flood. And so therefore we're going to say, okay, to construct something in this area with this floodplain, you need to be 60 centimetres higher than something that might be your neighbour's house, which was built 40 years ago.
And when you say we, you're talking about the council.
Sorry, we the council, yeah.
Yeah, we the people, i.e. the local city council. And so what's true is that generally properties that are newer, not necessarily a new build, but newer, are going to be built to a different standard than older properties. Now, I wanted to actually look into some of the details. So I've looked at the Christchurch City's district plan. And in fact, I'm going to put it up on the screen for everybody watching on YouTube. What they've got is what they call flood management area catchments. Now, what that effectively means is that in flood-prone areas in Christchurch, they've got specific models about how you've got to design the house. What's really interesting is that they often talk about minimum floor levels. So that's how high the slab or the floor of your property is above the ground. And what they do in Christchurch is you've actually got to build it high enough off the ground that it can withstand a 1 in 200 year rainfall event and a 1 in 20 year tidal event.
And that's including a 1 metre sea level rise.
Yeah, so even if the sea level comes up by a metre, your property, if it's built whenever these standards were implemented, so today onwards, probably a couple of years ago onwards, it's going to be built to a different standard. Now, I wanted to put this to the test because a big one is the floor level. And so I started looking around on Google Street View, or it might have been Apple Maps Street View, to see how properties are different today. Now, I called up a good friend of the show, Kyle Brookland, and he was suggesting that there are quite a few on Gloucester Street in Christchurch where we see this. So here I've got an example of a new build. It's 317 Gloucester Street. And if we just look at the front of the property, we can see that this is a new build development of a couple of townhouses, probably about, I don't know, maybe 16 in there.
I'd say 14, given that's what was the number.
Oh, well, no, there's actually a 15 as well, Andrew. So we were somewhere in between. But the front units, you can see, are 3 steps up. So you've got to take 3 steps up before you get in the front door. So those properties are raised above the street level. And then the properties behind are kind of up a bit of a ramp. Now, if I go and just a little bit down the street and look at properties that were probably not that
These probably
old,
look within the last 10 years or maybe even the last 5 years by the looks of it.
but we can see that they are not raised off the ground. So you just walk off the street. You don't have to walk up any steps. Now, what that means is if we saw a lot of floodwater, these are going to be more susceptible compared to some newer properties where they are raised up off the ground. And in fact, I've created some screenshots for you where you can see that, yep, you've got to walk up some steps to get into that property. So it's probably about 60 odd centimetres, maybe half a metre, 600 millimetres if you're a builder. Whereas some of those other properties, they're just built directly on the ground. So they're going to be more susceptible to flooding.
So if you manage to get flooding in that first one, probably the entire street's buggered at that stage.
And the thing you've got to be really careful about in Christchurch is that most of the city is a flood-prone area. So their map from Christchurch City is nowhere near as user-friendly.
Oh, it's quite clunky, isn't it?
Yeah, but because Christchurch is quite a low-lying city, like most of it is in what's called a flood management area. Now, I recently moved back to Auckland, but I was living on Hurley Street, 12A Hurley Street. I can tell you that now because we're not going to have any crazy exes or podcast fans come knock on my door. 12A Hurley Street. And so that was in a really flood-prone area. Now, what's interesting, if I actually just come back to Apple Maps, I'll show you it was right down the road from the River Avon. And what used to happen is that the river would often flood. It was not the best thing, because I'd be sitting there in my house trying to work on my data in here, and then the river here would flood. And in fact, I've got a photo for you in a second where I'll show you it. Now, what was really interesting was this property was raised up off the ground
Significantly.
probably by about 1.5 meters. So even when the flood water came in, because the water came up over the bank, the house itself was fine because it was raised up so significantly above the water. Now, there are a couple of tricks here because it wasn't all good, but I want to show you a property down the street that was built not as recently, and that is just, it's up a little bit from the road, but it's going to be much more susceptible because it's effectively built at ground level, that specific property just down the road. So what I'm trying to get across is that properties that are built maybe in the 60s, 70s, they're going to be built to a different standard compared to properties that were built perhaps in the last 10 years. So you'll want to check your specific property where it's going to be raised off the ground a bit more.
And you notice this a lot in Canterbury because you had a lot of properties that were earthquake damaged, and so your neighbour's house might be fine, but your house had to be rebuilt, and then you're built to the new standard, and so you'll be driving down the street, and then there'll just be one which is massively raised up.
Well, and apparently that happens quite a lot in Bromley. Again, I was on the phone to a couple of building inspectors, and I said, it happens all the time where you might have a newer property that is maybe 1.5 meters off the ground next to an existing property that is right at ground level. And so you see that difference. So which properties are going to be more susceptible to flooding? It's going to be ones that were built in the 60s, 70s, 50s, anything that's closer down to the ground. But there are some tricks as well. So in Hurley Street, and I'll take you there actually on Google Street View, because it's quite interesting. There were quite a lot of new builds being built. So now this is about 6 townhouses in here. You used to own some houses back behind here, didn't you?
Right there.
And there were some townhouses being built here. Now, one of the issues was my property did not have a car park. Okay, so my house was raised up above the ground. When the river broke and there was water all across the street, sweet, that property was fine. But here is Andrew's car. So Andrew used to lend me his car when I lived in Christchurch.
When I trusted you.
And this is a very expensive Porsche that is very low-lying to the ground. And so I'm up there, all la-di-da-di-da, and I think this was the day I had a date actually on, and I thought I will look so cool driving around in Andrew's car.
Boat.
Well, I wasn't that cool because it was so low to the ground that it flooded and got written off. Now,
thanks again.
Yeah, sorry for that, mate. But the important thing here is you might think, oh, well, it's all good. If I buy a new build or a newer property, then I don't have to worry about flood risk. But if you buy a townhouse that doesn't have a car park, what happens to your tenants or your car if the street itself gets flooded? So it's not just about your house, it's also about, well, where's your car going to be? Now, one thing that's really interesting is when developers build properties today, often the garage or the car parks won't be raised well above ground level. So, oh yes, you're giving me a look.
Sure? Really?
Often that's the case because why would you? Because if it's a garage, it's often just a concrete floor. So if it gets flooded, what's the issue? So if you see, well, that obviously in this specific case, but even if you think about many of the townhouses that you will have been to, often the car parks are just at ground level, but the houses are raised an extra 60 centimetres.
Possibly. Yeah, you might be right.
A developer's often not going to put in an extra couple of cubic meters of concrete just to raise the cars up because they don't need to.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is you're about to ask me about your development.
Yeah. So Sudgeon Street, which I did just recently, just completed, we had to raise that up quite significantly.
Yeah, it's probably because of how your site specifically was. If I think about, so those ones were specifically raised up probably about another, 60, 90 centimetres above ground.
Yes.
For many, I was on the phone to a developer yesterday and he was like, most people, this was in Auckland, most people wouldn't do that because it's extra cost.
Really?
So that's one thing you've got to look out for. And when I was talking to a Christchurch-based building inspector, they were saying as well, yeah, generally speaking, you've also got to think about your car. So there are a few things just to think about when we are purchasing properties. So let me ask you, Andrew, after looking at all of this, would you buy in a flood-prone area? We've talked about a couple that are close or near to them. Would you?
I think the reality is I already own properties that are in flood prone areas, and that's just the reality of life. We've got a natural disaster risk all across New Zealand, and we always will. But you probably just want to do a bit of digging if you're about to buy something. One of the things, because I buy a lot of new now, I probably worry a lot less than I used to when I was buying existing properties. So if I were going to buy an existing property in Christchurch, I'd really dig into the detail and check, okay, well, what does it say on the limb? Is this going to be a problem with insurance? Because if I can insure my way out of the risk, I'm probably okay with it.
Well, if you think about something like even the flood-prone areas in Auckland, you're talking about a 1% risk per year, a 14% risk over 15 years. That's something you can often insure your way out of.
Absolutely. And so, you might pay a little bit more insurance, but that's not the end of the world. It's better than paying for the damage done because you haven't got the insurance. So I probably am less concerned nowadays with the fact that the councils are putting such high standards on the developers to make sure. But if you are buying it existing, you really need to make sure that you're comfortable with it.
I'll tell you something interesting. So I've been playing around a lot with the Auckland Council map. And so I don't choose the properties that our investors look at here at Opus Partners, but I started putting in addresses. And I saw that one development that I've currently actually been researching a little bit, 12 Greenock Road in West Auckland, actually is in a flood-prone area. It's on a floodplain. It's got a flood-prone area on the road. So in an extreme weather event, then you actually could have some flooding in this area. Now, that made me really concerned because we don't want investors buying properties that are just going to flood constantly. And so Andrew said, call up the developer and talk to them about the sort of requirements that you have to have for a new build these days. And what's really interesting is this specific development, each unit has to have a 2,000 litre tank underneath each house.
2,000?
2,000. I told you this at breakfast this morning.
I was just trying to make it exciting for you.
I told him at breakfast this morning a 2,000 litre tank under these units, and he did not seem very interested.
I'm just doing it for you now.
And now you're in front of the cameras for the YouTube, in front of the mics for the podcast audience, and here you go.
2,000?
Yeah, 2,000 litres. It's a lot. And so they've got to put what's called, they're called aqua, what are they called? I was talking about it this morning. Aquacomb. They've got to put what's called Aquacomb, so I think that's the brand name, which is an underground water tank beneath the properties. And what that does is it catches all of the rainwater off the roof, and then it slowly releases the water into the council's stormwater drains. So why do floods happen? Often it's because all of the council's drains that are taking the rainwater away, they get overflowed. Now, if you put a whole heap of new build properties together on one site, you've got a whole heap of roof and concrete catching rainwater that can't absorb into the soil. And so you now have to put these massive tanks underneath specific areas to catch that water and then slowly release it into the council drains at an appropriate time.
What a wonderful business.
Well, what this actually made me think as well is that it's not always just what you can see. So we showed screenshots before showing, oh, look at those properties. They're 60 centimetres above the ground level. That's really cool. But what you'd also want to check is, well, what's underneath those properties potentially collecting this water that is going to stop that specific area from flooding as well. So these are a couple of things you'll need to look out for. I just want to ask, okay, if this is in a flood-prone area, how is the property being built differently to prevent it from flooding? Because we can see that it's potentially going to be an issue, over the next 15 years. Well, there's a smaller than 1 in 5 chance over a 15-year period that there could be a flood. But what if it happens? But that also got me thinking as well, Andrew, well, maybe there's some opportunities here. So if I can look on these maps and see, it's in a flood-prone area, does that potentially provide an opportunity for a property investor?
Absolutely. So I was just remembering there's an area in Christchurch where there were massive floods, and it was called the Floxton Basin or something like that. And about after the earthquakes, there were major flooding. Now, I think I own 3 properties in that area that I bought at significantly discounted prices after the floods because everyone was worried. Now, what happened? The council went in, said, we need to deal with this. This can never happen again. They spent so much on infrastructure of the drains. Now, there's no flooding there. There's flooding in different areas. I'm fine. My properties are worth a fortune.
Lucky Andrew Nicol, the person who owns 30 plus properties who really needed a break and some extra capital
Look,
growth.
I'm just saying there's opportunities. I think you've got to remember there's always opportunities in a market. You've just got to be a bit brave sometimes.
One thing that you've also got to keep in mind is if we think about some of those floods that we've had recently, the councils are building properties up to, I think the development in Greenock Road that I just talked about, the floor level is up so that it withstands a 1 in 100 year rainfall event. We've got to remember the one we just had, the Auckland anniversary floods, Auckland saw about a month's worth of rain in a single day. So that was a 1 in 200 year rainfall event. That's not going to happen every year. Yes, with global warming, we may see some of these extreme weather events happen more frequently, but that was NIWA, which is a Crown-owned, government-owned research institution, said there was a 1 in 200 year event. Right. So even if your specific property that you own now did get flooded in that event, it doesn't mean that it's going to keep getting flooded every couple of years for the rest of your ownership period. That was a real one-off. Even if we think about Cyclone Gabrielle that we recently had, and we've had a really unlucky time here in New Zealand, that was the costliest cyclone ever in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think was the deadliest in about 50 years.
Wow.
So really, really unfortunate that we've had these extreme weather events. Good that it's making us think about flooding risks, but I wouldn't say, hey, we've had a usual year here in New Zealand. We definitely should think about how our properties are built, but that's not going to keep continuing, or it's highly unlikely that it's going to keep continuing year after year. Having said that, we do need to take flood risk seriously, but just remember, half of Christchurch is in a flood risk zone. If we look at Invercargill, a significant proportion of Invercargill is also in a flood risk zone. It doesn't mean that we should only not buy in flood-prone areas, but we should really think about how are we mitigating the potential risks, how can we use insurance to insure our way out of it, and how do we buy properties that are built to a standard that can withstand those floods. That's what we've got to think about. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the Property Academy podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening to this on your podcast app, maybe check out the YouTube video as well. Just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe and that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.